Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is David Song, and I'm the Exec Director at Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our staff and our friends at Third Place Books, it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our presentation with Dr. Frederick Appelbaum and Gabriel Spitzer. Dr. Appelbaum's new book, Living Medicine, is the subject of tonight's talk. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them and acknowledge our continuing debt for the use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We also wanted to acknowledge and thank you, and we are glad to have you join us tonight. A few housekeeping notes. Our presentation tonight will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. When we get to the Q&A portion of the event, you may ask your question through the microphone. I think there's one right here. Or you can use your smartphone to scan the QR code, which will be up on the screen, and submit your question digitally. For those of you watching virtually, we will drop the link in the chat as well, and you can submit a question at any time. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and you can help us by keeping your question concise. For those of you asking questions live, please make sure you have a question. If you'd like to do a lecture yourself here at Town Hall, your time to shine will be some other time, but not tonight. Also a reminder, if you're watching the program with closed captions virtually, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of your screen for the video player closed captioning as well. We have a few new events and podcasts that you should be aware of that we're adding every day. On June 11th, we'll have a wonderful program with a sweeping cultural history of nursing with journalist Sarah De Gregorio, talking about caretakers past and present. On the 13th, for those of you who are adventurers, Rachel Newer will explore the unlikely history of how the drug MDMA emerged from the shadows to the forefront of a medical revolution. Visit our website to join. I heard some oohs for that. It is very interesting, I agree. Visit our website to join our email list and get updates as more programs are added throughout this season and for next season to come. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Specifically for tonight, our Arno G. Matulski Science Lecture Series is supported by Microsoft. And special thanks to our media sponsor, Science in Seattle. Town Hall is also a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members joining us. Round of applause for our members here tonight and those supporting us. If you're not already a member, and if you share Town Hall's goal of a community energized and empowered by questions of politics, science, and culture, like tonight's program, please consider supporting us by becoming a member, donating, or finding information on membership tonight on our website or talk to one of our staff. Lastly, you will absolutely want to dig into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of Dr. Appelbaum's book. Please click the link in the chat for those of you watching virtually, or in the lobby, pick up your own copy through Third Place Books tonight. Now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Fred Appelbaum is a physician scientist at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center. Round of applause. I know a lot of you here from Fred Hutch. Let's hear from Fred Hutch. One of our best local institutions, and Dr. Fred has been blessed to be a long and successful cancer researcher with a career including Fred Hutch. His work has ranged from studying basic molecular abnormalities of the disease to conducting national and international studies of the treatment of cancer. He's currently on the scientific advisory boards of Memorial Sloan Kettering, which he chairs, Johns Hopkins, MD Anderson, University of Pennsylvania, and UC San Francisco. Talking to Fred tonight will be Gabriel Spitzer, who is an editor on NPR's Science Desk covering global health and development. Gabriel previously served as the senior editor of NPR's daily science podcast Shortwave, and comes to NPR following years at public radio stations, including in my hometown of Chicago, and most recently at KNKX in Seattle, where he covers science and health before founding Transmission, one of the country's first podcasts about the COVID-19 pandemic. Please welcome me tonight in welcoming Dr. Fred Appelbaum and Gabriel Spitzer. Let's hear for them.
Hello. Wow, that's echoey. Greetings, everybody. My name is Gabriel Spitzer. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight on this sort of disorientingly pleasant Seattle evening. It's really something. It's great to see so many folks here, and it's really wonderful to be here with you, Fred, And thank you so much for this book, Living Medicine. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, I'm excited for you because it's really a master class in how science transpires in the real world. It is a history lesson in this incredible chapter of discovery that happened right here in Seattle. And it's also like a character study of this individual, Donnall Thomas, who was able to, shoulder so many burdens and setbacks and failures and so on, and managed to persist and keep his humanity about him and make discoveries that are saving lives still. So anyway, I'm really excited to talk about it. Fred, thank you so much for writing the book. Maybe we could start by getting our arms around what Donnall Thomas was up against. So thinking about some of the diseases that he was confronting, and specifically these blood cancers like leukemia. Can you talk about what leukemia is and what the prognosis for someone with that disease would have been like in the mid-20th century when Donnall Thomas was getting started?
Thanks, Gabriel. To understand leukemia, it helps to understand blood, which is a yellow liquid, the plasma, in which three kinds of cells float around. There's red cells that carry oxygen from your lungs to your muscles to metabolize glucose. There's white cells that fight infection, and there's platelets that keep you from bleeding. These cells are short-lived, and so they have to be continually produced. In fact, every second you produce 2 million red cells. Every second. So that's 200 billion red cells a day, 400 billion platelets a day, 10 billion white cells a day. And those are produced in the bone marrow. That's that kind of gelatinous material that's inside ossobuco, that you take out. Tastes good. But inside that kind of gelatinous fatty material are bone marrow stem cells. Those are the seed cells. And they have to divide time and time again. I mean, when you imagine how many cells have to be produced, you can imagine how often they have to divide. And each time they divide, they have to exactly copy their DNA so each of their descendants has the same DNA. And if they make a mistake, then that descendant's DNA may be abnormal and cause that cell and all of its descendants to grow in an uncontrolled fashion. And if that happens, and those cells from that one clone start to grow more rapidly and crowd out the rest of the bone marrow, that's leukemia. And you no longer are producing the normal red cells, and so you become anemic. You don't produce the normal white cells, and so you're susceptible to infection, and you don't produce the normal platelets, and so you're susceptible to bleeding. Now, there are two big categories of leukemia. And the cases are about half and half, but half of them are acute leukemia, and that develops very rapidly, and if it's untreated, death follows in just weeks to a month or two. So it's a devastating disease. And prior to 1960, there were a few very short-term remissions that were achieved with the very new chemotherapies that were being developed, but by and large, acute leukemia was an absolute death sentence, and that's what Don was facing.
Yeah. So if somebody received that diagnosis in 1960, 1965, they didn't have a lot of reason for optimism. There wasn't a lot on the horizon there that could help them.
There was nothing for him, really.
Yeah. So what drew Donnall Thomas to this, gigantic problem that didn't seem to have a good answer?
So I think there were three things. Don himself said that he found leukemia to be such a devastating disease, he felt like he owed it to the patients to try and do something about it. And this is when he was in medical school at Harvard in the 1940s. The second thing that drew him to leukemia was that if you just took a blood sample, just drew blood, you saw the leukemic cells there, so you could actually get your hands on them every day or every week if you needed to, as opposed to something like pancreatic cancer where you you couldn't get your hands on the tumor except maybe once with a biopsy. He said studying a disease where you could actually see it and study it just made sense to him. And then the third thing was that there was this little crack in the door. The very first chemotherapies that were used in the 1940s by Farber did bring about a very short-term remission, and so there was this possibility that maybe you could do something. So it was those three things, I think: the devastation of the disease, its accessibility, and the fact that there was a hint that maybe it might respond to some kinds of therapy that drew him.
So those chemotherapeutics that you're talking about in the middle of the 20th century were really just starting to be developed. That was the route, the modality that we were looking at cancer, the lens that we were looking at cancer through. What was it about bone marrow and the possibility of transplanting it that sort of sparked the curiosity in Don Thomas?
That's a great question, Gabriel, and it's ironic that this life-saving therapy that Don developed came about from really an overwhelming number of deaths. When the atomic bombs dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about 200,000 people were killed. Now, 80% of them were killed acutely from the heat, the percussion of the blast. But 20% survived and looked like they were starting to recover, but then weeks later, they started to develop bleeding and infection, and they died. And when doctors examined those victims, they found that what had happened is that the radiation had destroyed their bone marrow. And by destroying the bone marrow, then those patients were no longer able to make red cells, white cells, and platelets, and that's why they were dying. Shortly after the war ended, driven by fear of other nuclear wars or accidents, a number of individuals started doing some experiments in the Argonne Radiation Research Institute and elsewhere around the United States. And they found that they could radiate a mouse and essentially do the same thing that happened with atomic bomb victims. That is, the mice would die after a week or two. But if they took bone marrow cells from a genetically identical mouse and infused them intravenously into the radiated mouse would recover. Now, Don was just finishing up his training in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when he read about those first experiments, and it just struck him that, well, if you could destroy a normal bone marrow and replace it, why shouldn't you be able to destroy an abnormal bone marrow, like a leukemic bone marrow or a bone marrow of someone with sickle-cell disease, and replace that and therefore cure patients? And so that was the aha moment that Don had, and that was the idea that never left him, really.
All right, so now we're going to jump forward in time a few decades here to 1975, when a young doc named Fred Appelbaum enters the scene. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the first time that you saw Don Thomas in the flesh, the talk that he was giving, and kind of how people were reacting to the type of research he was doing.
Well, by the mid-1970s, and we will go back and talk about how he got from there to there, but there were, for the first time, some patients that he was able to treat and get remissions and what looked to be potentially cures, but it was only a very small percent. It was about 1 in 10, and the other 9 were actually dying oftentimes quicker than they might have if they had not had a transplant. They died from some of the toxicities of the attempt to cure them. And the audience, when I heard him, it was the first time I actually saw Don, I was just struck with how matter-of-fact he was. This is what we did, this is why we did it. There was no, I'm right and other people are wrong, or just, these are the facts. But he was curing people that were facing death within weeks, and it was just, I was just so entranced by that. And I heard the talk, and like these meetings, there's a coffee break, and I was walking around. I was just a fellow in training, and I was listening to some of the other people there say, "That's butchery. How could he be doing that? This is insane. He's a cowboy. That he's hastening the deaths of these other people." In my book, I talk about 2 approaches, and one is the quote from Hippocrates, which says, first do no harm. But then there's the other quote that comes from Hamlet, where Shakespeare writes that diseases desperate are by desperate appliance cured, or not at all. And so those 2 kind of statements are in opposition to one another, and clearly Don felt that desperate diseases needed desperate measures.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting that this must have come at a cost to him in some ways, because it's just such a grind to get through this trial after trial. You don't have the hindsight we have now to know that you're going to succeed. People are suffering, people are dying, people are not understanding why you're doing it. It just must have taken an enormous amount of commitment to keep pushing in the face of all of that pushback.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when Don had the first idea of marrow transplantation, he was at Harvard. He had just been hired as a hematologist at Harvard, and he had this idea that maybe transplantation could be made to work. It worked in these identical twin mice. And so he proposed that to Farber, who was the boss then, and Farber said, no, that's a crazy idea. You're not going to do that here. We're not going to give you space. We're not going to give you resources. And so in 1955, Don said, okay, I want to do it. I'm obviously not going to have to be able to do it at Harvard. So he left Harvard and he moved to the Imogene Bassett Hospital, the Imogene Bassett Hospital in Cooperstown, New York, of all places. And the reason he moved there was not because of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He moved there because there was this guy by the name of Joe Farabee, who he had met earlier, who also had the idea of the potential for marrow transplantation. So that was in 1955 when he moves to Cooperstown.
But yeah, he really had to go find a sort of a boutique research institution that would support what was then a pretty touchy kind of area to be into. It was really fascinating how he found his way there and then managed to accumulate kindred spirits around him every step of the way.
Yeah, the hospital in Cooperstown had a very generous benefactor, the Clarks, who gave them enough money to try and do some research there. And so in 1956, when he gets there, he says, okay, we're going to try doing transplants in humans. And he does 6 transplants in patients. He does not know how to type donor and recipient. He doesn't even know if you can safely give bone marrow intravenously in humans. And he gives the infusion to the 6 patients. You could give bone marrow intravenously without causing sudden death, but none of the grafts took. All the patients died within a couple of weeks, and it was a total failure, his first attempts. But, you know, that didn't stop him. He kept working. And so over the next couple years, he's trying to figure out how to do these transplants. He goes into animal models to try and answer some of these questions about how do you possibly select the right donor recipient. But he also does a few transplants in patients who have identical twins. And there he found in a couple young kids who had leukemia that you could give radiation and the leukemia would decrease, and you could give the bone marrow infusion and their normal counts would recover. But unfortunately, the leukemia came roaring back. And then when he tried it in individuals who didn't have identical twins, the marrow was always rejected and it wasn't working. And then in 1960, he gets invited to Seattle to give a talk. And he's just giving a talk about his experience that isn't working very well. He says that, you know, when I try it in identical twins with leukemia, the leukemia comes right back, and when I try it in individuals who aren't identical, the graft gets rejected. But we're still working on it in the laboratory. And he finishes his talk, and just then a young resident, a second-year resident, comes running up. His name was Marino Robbins, and he says, Dr. Thomas, I think I have the ideal patient for you. And Don says, who's that? And he says, well, I'm taking care of this 6-year-old girl who has aplastic anemia and is dying from aplastic anemia and happens to have an identical twin. Now, in aplastic anemia, there's no malignant cell. It's just that the marrow has failed. It stops working, probably because of a toxin or an immune response. And so there's no disease you have to eradicate. And with an identical twin, maybe the marrow could be transplanted. Now, get this, now Don is a visitor. He doesn't have a state license to practice medicine in Seattle. He doesn't have privileges at a hospital. To do that would take you 6 months now. But it was a different day and age. And so Robbins takes Thomas they talk to the kid's parents, and Robbins takes Thomas into the operating room, and they take the young girl named Nancy Lowry's sister, Barbara, to the operating room, and they remove bone marrow from her hip bones and her shins. It take about 44 bone marrow aspirates. Then Thomas shows Robbins how to filter the marrow. Then they take the marrow back to Nancy's bed and they infuse the cells to her. And a week later, her counts are recovering. And 2 months later, she's back in school looking exactly like her identical twin. You can't tell them apart. Now, that was in 1960, so that's 63 years ago. Nancy grew up to be a school nurse dealing with special ed kids, Barbara, an occupational therapist. And the last I talked with them, they were still doing fine. In fact, is Nancy here? Nancy? Okay. You're looking at the first person on the face of the earth ever cured with a bone marrow transplant. That's Nancy.
Thank you so much for coming, and let us wish the absolute best to you and your family. It's really incredible to see you. Thank you. Can you talk a little more about why the twin work was so important and what the problem that it gave Don insight into is, and particularly about the idea of marrow rejection and your body's immune response to a transplanted tissue or organ?
Yeah, if it hadn't been for these early twin studies, I don't know that Don could have kept going. You know,
Wow.
there was so many failures in the animal models and what he was trying to do early on in humans. But then you had the short-lived remission in some of the twins with leukemia, then you had the Nancy's cure. It was the kind of thing that kept Don going, believing that he would be able to crack this nut if he kept working. As I talked to him, and he said, you know, if I ever came to a true dead end, I probably would have tried to do something else, but I never got there. There was always another experiment to try, another approach to take. And it took him 10 years to go from Nancy in 1960 to being able to figure out how to actually do transplants between not just identical twins, but between siblings who were matched. And the three things he had to figure out was, number one, how to select for donor-recipient compatibility. Now, we know about ABO, you know, red cells, you're A or B, or AB or you're O, but for tissue compatibility, it's incredibly more complex, and it's governed by something called HLA. And so he had to kind of figure out how HLA worked, and he did that in the animal models along with Reiner Storb, who was just a hero at that time working with Don and others, and there was work going on in other institutes around the country. So that was the first. And then he had to figure out how to give the chemotherapy or radiation before the transplant to keep the patient from rejecting the bone marrow. And then afterwards, he had to figure out how to keep the bone marrow from rejecting the patient. Because with marrow transplantation, you're actually transferring the immune system from the donor to the recipient. It's not like a kidney transplant where it's the recipient rejecting the kidney. With bone marrow transplants, the graft is going to reject the patient, and so there's a two-way immunologic battle going on. But he worked all that out in animal models, and all the details are way too much to describe tonight, but that took him about a decade, from 1960 to 1970, and then by 1970, Don was ready to go back to the clinical challenge of doing transplants in humans who weren't just identical twins.
Yeah. So let's talk about those first years in Seattle in 1970 when Don was going back into the clinic. He set up his clinic at the old Public Health Service Hospital, the old Amazon headquarters up there on the hill, and created what seems, a little bit of feedback there, created what seems like a really unique and vibrant place to do research. Can you talk about like what the culture of that place was and what the people there were like?
Thanks, Gabriel. It's a really interesting question. When Don went back to try allogeneic transplants in patients, the only patients that would be referred to him, of course, were on death's door. I mean, they were incredibly sick. And then you're going to make them even sicker by giving them chemotherapy and radiation, and you had to wait for the new bone marrow to start to function. And so Don realized that to allow these patients to survive, he was going to have to do everything humanly possible to keep them alive during that period of time. And so he created his own little sort of Department of Medicine to do that. He put the patients in laminar airflow rooms. You know, the boy in the plastic bubble, John Travolta, that was his start to fame. I don't know if you remember it. But the boy in the plastic bubble, so these patients were put in these sterile environments. Had to figure out how to give them sterile food, and so he had to hire Sandra Aker, the first nutritionist that came to help. He had to hire infectious disease experts who were focused on nothing but infectious disease complications in the transplant patient. Joel Myers was one of the first, and same thing with GI complications. He had to have pharmacists who knew how to deal with these new drugs that other people were not used to using, and he had to have nurses. I don't have words for that. These were nurses who were willing to deal with the sickest of the sick patients, knowing that 9 out of 10 of them were not going to survive, but wanting to do everything humanly possible to keep them alive. Those nurses, well, many of them stayed for 20, 30, 40 years with our transplant program from the beginning. Recently, they invited me to a luncheon. The retired nurses, they still get together once a month. Matter of fact, I see a lot of them in the audience. Can the nurses stand up, the transplant nurses? They're some of the truly finest people I've ever known. So anyway, one more story about that. When one of the first patients Don transplanted was a young boy, 10-year-old, by the name of Stephen McCarty. And he was so sick that they couldn't fly him on a commercial jet. They had to fly him, they got a military plane to fly him up from Southern California. This is in 1971, so one of the first successful transplants. And Stephen was transplanted from his sibling for aplastic anemia, and he survived. And then patients generally stayed in Seattle for about 3 months after the transplant. And after 3 months, they're getting ready to go home. And Stephen's mother, Marion, says she wants to talk to Don Thomas. Well, Marion was a social worker, and so she walks into Don's office and she says, "You need a social worker. You need someone that's going to go and pick up the patients at the airport, going to bring them here, going to explain what's going to happen to them, meet with them to help them solve some of the logistical problems of living here. And I'm a social worker, and I'm going to move to Seattle, and I'm going to do that." And so Don says, "Oh, that's beautiful. That's a great idea, but I don't have any money to pay you. I don't have enough money now, this is early on, to pay my doctors, really. There's just no way." And Marion said, "That's okay, I'll do it for free." And so she did. She moved her family from Southern California to Seattle, became our first social worker, and did it for 2 years for free until Don was able to cobble together a salary for her. That was the kind of spirit that existed on that ward. If a patient survived and went home, there would be a potluck lunch for them. If a patient died, the nurse that was specialing them would be encouraged to take the next day off, just to recover. It was sort of its own little island of people that were really dedicated to making transplantation happen.
Yeah, clearly nobody saw that as just a job. That was a calling for everybody. Well, during that course of time, as you said, the HLA typing sort of technology and the basic science behind that began to emerge. And so this is the way that you can match a donor and a recipient in such a way to not get either the rejection of the organ or the graft versus host disease that you described. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that came together, because it is extraordinarily complicated and sophisticated, the way that these different types and little molecules on the outsides of our cells tell each other, I'm from this guy and I'm from the other guy. So it's an incredibly difficult challenge to transplantation, and also just a hard kind of concept to understand. How did they get from not knowing that that existed, to even knowing what to look for, and eventually the HLA typing that we have today?
So the science behind it is pretty complex, and I explain a lot of that in the book. Hopefully that's understandable. Writing a book like that, I was trying to thread the needle between not cheating the science, because it was so complicated. I wanted to explain the science and how hard it was to overcome that. So I tried to make it honest in that regard, but I certainly didn't want to, bore the non-scientist or keep the narrative from going forward rapidly enough. And so I tried to thread that needle between it. And probably the place it was the hardest was the story about HLA. But HLA is the way that a person, their body tells self from non-self. And as I said, it's much, much more complicated than ABO. And in fact, it took many, many people decades to really figure it out. But eventually, they went from not understanding HLA at all in the 1950s, in the era when really it came to pass that you could figure out how to do HLA typing happened between 1960 and 1970. And by 1970, people now had a fair understanding of how to do HLA typing. And when they did that, what they found was that HLA is located on its many genes. It's a constellation of genes, but they're all together on chromosome 6. And since you get one chromosome 6 from mom and one chromosome 6 from dad, and each person has two chromosome 6s, there's a 1 in 4 chance that you or your sibling would inherit the same chromosome 6 from mom that your sibling did, and the same chromosome 6 from dad. So that meant when we were doing transplants during the 70s, that we could do transplants if you had a donor, but that was only 1 in 3 people on average, given that the average family was 2 to 3 kids. And that meant for the other 2/3 of patients, we had nothing to offer. And that's how things stood. And during the 70s, our outcomes in transplantation between siblings kept getting better and better as we were improving our infectious disease control, understanding how to control graft versus host disease a little better, understanding how to give the right doses of drugs. And so our cure rates went from 15% to 25%. And then as we were starting to transplant patients earlier in the course of the disease, it was going up to 50 and 60% for certain diseases, which was terrific. Certainly not perfect, but better than what we had before. But for those that didn't have a match, we just said, sorry, there's nothing we could do up until the late 1970s.
Right. And you talk about the 1 in 4 chance that 2 siblings will have inherited the same HLA type. What is the chance that 2 strangers would have the same type?
Well, that's a great question, Gabe, and probably around 1 in 10,000.
Oh, gosh.
So it turns out that the HLA is the most, the term we use in medicine is polymorphic, the most variable gene there is. And so there's, hundreds of HLA-As, hundreds of HLA-Bs, and hundreds of HLA-Ds. And then when you look at all the combinations of them, you can imagine that it just gets to be really, really, really large. Then in 1979, as I said, we could only transplant, like 1 in 3. And then one of my colleagues, who was probably the most knowledgeable person on the face of the earth about HLA, a guy by the name of John Hansen, was sitting in his office at the Hutch, and there's a knock on the door, and there's this guy wearing a cowboy hat, big guy, and he has a satchel of papers, and he says to John, he hadn't called ahead for a meeting. It wasn't this guy's style to do that. He said, Dr. Hansen, my name's Bob Graves. I have a 10-year-old girl, and I need your help. And John invites him in, and he said, what's going on? And he said, well, my 10-year-old girl has leukemia. She's failed first-line chemotherapy. If we don't transplant her, I know she's going to die. I've done a little work on HLA. It turned out that Bob was a veterinarian that had a big cattle, well, actually a dairy ranch, but he had done his homework and he knew enough biology to be able to read about HLA. And he said, I know that HLA is very variable, But there are some types that are more common than others. And I happen to know that Laura has the most common HLA type that anyone could possibly have. And so while I know it's not 1 in 10,000, it may be 1 in 100. And I'll bet if you tried, you could probably find an unrelated donor for her. Would you be willing to do that? And so John said, well, it's not up to me. Let's go down and talk to Donnall Thomas. And Don said, I think it's the time we should try that. And so John had been doing HLA typing on a lot of the staff at the Hutch just to learn about HLA typing, and he had files about this. Now, I'm not talking about computer files. I'm talking about a little wooden box, 3 by 5 with those little cards in them. That's what a file was then. And he goes through the files, and sure enough, one of our technicians had the exact same HLA type as Laura. And so now this created an ethical problem. The technician had given blood just for experiments. She hadn't volunteered to be a donor. Now, if we talked to her about, would you be willing to be a donor, and she said no, then she'd be living with the guilt of not helping this kid. And if she said yes, she would have to go to an operating room and have a needle stuck in her hip bone 100 times. So it was, now today, you actually couldn't talk to her. But again, this was a different era. And we did talk to her, and she was willing to do it. And we did the transplant, and it worked. And Laura recovered. She did die of leukemia 2 years later, but the transplant itself worked. The graft took. There was no graft versus host disease. And Bob Graves became totally enamored with this. He was going to do everything he could, and he started the Laura Graves Foundation. And he was trying to get money to build a registry where we could get people from all over the country to be possible donors. But as you say, if it's 1 in 10,000, you'd have to need a huge registry. And the rest of the population just didn't think it was worthwhile, and he could not get funding from the government at that time. Then a few years later, I got a phone call from a colleague of mine in Bethesda, and he said, Fred, I have a patient I want you to see, and his name is Elmo Zumwalt III. And he's a young man who has lymphoma, and I think he needs a transplant, and I think I'd like you to see him and do that. And so Elmo came out to see me, and I worked him up, and I learned a little more about his history, and it was really poignant. Elmo was a PT boat captain during the Vietnam War, going into the rivers in Vietnam. His father, Elmo Zumwalt Jr., was in charge of the entire naval operations during the Vietnam War, and his father was the one that ordered Agent Orange to defoliate the rivers to keep the snipers from being able to kill the PT boat captains. Well, after the war, it became clear that Agent Orange was contaminated with dioxin, which almost certainly is what caused his son's lymphoma. And neither his son or his dad ever had any doubts that that's what happened. But, his father said, but I still probably would order Agent Orange because it kept so many people from getting killed by the snipers. So we did the transplant on Elmo, and while he was there, his father stayed with him, and I had an opportunity to introduce the Admiral to Don Thomas, and the Admiral said, well, Dr. Thomas, is there anything I can do to help the transplant efforts? And Don said, as a matter of fact, there is. We could use funding for a registry. And so Elmo Zumwalt, the Admiral, was able to get the Navy to contribute a number of millions of dollars, and that's how the National Marrow Donor Program began. The very first chair of the board of the NMDP was Bob Graves, and the very first vice chair was Admiral Zumwalt. And today, amazingly, there are about 40 million people around the world who have volunteered to be HLA type, to be a member of these registries. And with that advance, along with a few other advances, we went from a situation where we could only find donors for 1 in 3 to now, today, we can find donors for almost every patient in need.
So you've kind of brought us up to the present here. Can you talk a little bit about how the procedure works these days? What does a modern bone marrow transplant look like? How has it changed from those early efforts, and what are the success rates now as compared with those early times?
So, big question, Gabriel. I may not be able to answer it all, but I'll give you a little bit. I'll give you a little bit about it. So first of all, one of the things that's changed is that the sources of stem cells. We used to get the hematopoietic stem cells from the bone marrow because that's where they were the most common, most frequent. And so we would take patients to the operating room. And then in the 80s, we realized that those bone marrow stem cells do sometimes circulate in the peripheral blood. And not only that, but there are things we can do to so-called mobilize those stem cells to leave the bone marrow, circulate in the peripheral blood. And so now, instead of having to take patients to the operating room, which we still occasionally do, take donors to the operating room, the vast majority of transplants are done by taking stem cells from the peripheral blood. And so we take a donor, and we give them some medicines that cause the stem cells to leave the bone marrow, circulate in the peripheral blood. We can withdraw them through a process called leukapheresis, which takes about 3 hours. And it's a lot easier than the procedure in the OR, I can tell you.
Yeah, because you mentioned this, but it's literally like 100 needle sticks into the bone?
It is. And some of the donors ask me if it's painful. And I say, yeah, after about half an hour, my hand really starts to hurt. But it is getting it from the peripheral blood is much easier on the patients now, on the donors now. But also, stem cells also exist in cord blood. And so they're in very high numbers in cord blood. And so we can take cords that would otherwise be discarded and store them, and now they're cord blood banks where we keep those. And so, but whether we do bone marrow or peripheral blood or cord, at the end of the day, it's sort of the same procedure that is, we're transplanting stem cells. The second thing that happens that's different now is the preparative regimens, that is, the medicines that we give to allow the graft to take. And we've learned that we can give much less intensive therapy than we did before in certain circumstances, and the grafts will take. And in those circumstances, it's much easier on the patient. In fact, we do, not all, but we do many of our, this sounds incredible, we do many of our transplants in the outpatient setting. That is, the patients come, they're given lower dose chemotherapy or much lower dose radiation. They're given an infusion of the stem cells in the outpatient department, and they never have to be hospitalized. They can go through the whole procedure just coming in during the day and having their blood drawn and being seen. We've gotten much better in preventing graft versus host disease, which was one of the terrible outcomes of transplantation. And so in some circumstances, like in aplastic anemia, our cure rates, I would never say they're 100%, but they're very, very close to 100%. I think for the last 30 matched siblings in a row, they're 100% for aplastic anemia, where it used to be 30%. For certain forms of leukemia, it's in the 80 to 90% range. Jerry Radich is in the audience, I know, and Jerry published papers that showed, we were getting really high cure rates in many of these leukemias. In sickle-cell disease, which was, absolutely fatal disease, cure rates are 90 to 95% with transplantation. But there are other situations in which normal chemotherapy has failed. And the patients are still incredibly sick, and everything is, against them. They have very resistant disease. And in those circumstances, we still do transplants where it was like what Don was doing in the early days, where we can only offer a 15 or 20% chance of cure, but there's nothing else for them. And so we still try that, and our goal is to take those patients and make the cure rates in those patients similar to what it is on the good risk patients today.
So on the subject of gigantic questions that we don't have time to answer, maybe we could talk a little bit about just some of the technologies and breakthroughs that Don's work has enabled that go even beyond the marrow transplantation, some of the really, really hot areas of research and development right now at Fred Hutch.
Yeah, so I'll talk about 3 of those. The first person on the face of the earth who was ever cured of sickle-cell disease was a young girl by the name of Kimberlyn George. Kimberlin, but at the time that Kimberlin had sickle cell disease, still, even though it was a horrible disease and terrible pain, crises, and stroke and all the other things that went with it, people could still live for 20 or 30 years, and so we weren't quite ready to do transplants yet on those back in the 80s. Kimberlin showed up at the emergency room and had a bad sickle crisis, but when people looked at her blood, they found not just sickle cells, but they also found leukemia. And so we went ahead and she had a transplant for her leukemia, but in the course of curing her leukemia, her sickle cell disease was also cured. She wasn't transplanted for sickle cell disease, but it cured it. Once that happened, then it became more reasonable to think about doing transplants for sickle cell disease, and it got up to the point of where it is today, where cure rates are in the 90% range or so. But still, it's risky. Patients can have complications, and there's a lot of toxicity that goes with it, and you need a donor. But what we've more recently been able to do, and when I say we, I mean the scientific community, is we've been able to show that you can take out, since you're curing sickle cell disease if you give a patient a normal bone marrow, if you take out a patient with sickle cell disease their own bone marrow, and you correct the single gene defect that causes sickle cell disease, and you can do that in a number of ways, including CRISPR that you've probably now heard of, then you can reinfuse the patient's own gene-repaired marrow and cure them. And the first patient that was ever cured that way was Victoria Gray, still doing fine. And that approach now isn't science fiction. That's been approved by the FDA. It's called, it's Zynteglo. And it's really spectacular. Now, that is going to be, I mean, that's such an amazing breakthrough. You don't have to worry about graft versus host disease, graft rejection, or a donor. Much easier on the patient, but still it's resource intense. And we can do that in the United States, but it costs, I think Zynteglo is something like around $1.8 or $2 million for the process. Not going to be a solution for the 5 million people living in Central Africa. But more recently, we're finding that it may be possible, we're not there yet, but instead of having to take the stem cells out and repair them, we may be able to do it by simply injecting the viral vector, repairing the bone marrow in vivo, and curing the disease with a single shot.
Without even tamping down the immune system first, without the rounds of radiation, chemotherapy, and so on? Wow.
A single shot. We're not there yet, but we're moving rapidly in that direction, and I am confident it's going to happen. So the first big breakthrough is going to be curing these gene defects in bone marrow, and that includes sickle cell disease, it includes thalassemia, it's going to include other hematopoietic diseases or diseases of the immune system. Remember, your immune system comes from the bone marrow, and so you have severe combined immune deficiency disease that was cured with marrow transplantation. In fact, the first person ever cured of AIDS was Timothy Brown, much like Kimberlin George. Brown had leukemia, he also had AIDS, but they were able to find a donor that has a unique kind of cell that doesn't allow the virus to enter. They found a donor like that, used that as the donor for the transplant for leukemia. He was cured of leukemia and he was cured of AIDS. And so this may provide a way also of doing that. So curing these gene defective cells, diseases is one of the big breakthroughs that Don showed. The second one was a very unexpected finding that happened in the 70s. I shouldn't say unexpected. Some people had hypothesized that we would see this. But when we did transplants between identical twins, the rate of leukemia recurrence was much higher than when we did transplants between brothers and sisters who were matched but not identical. And further, relapse rates went down even more if there was graft versus host disease, so some evidence of an immune response of the donor against the recipient. And then if we took the immune cells out of the bone marrow to try and prevent graft versus host disease, relapse went right back up to twins. So that implied that there was something about the immune system of the donor that was seeing the leukemia in the patient as foreign and rejecting it. And so investigators at the Hutch, and chief among them were my close friend and colleague Phil Greenberg, Mac Cheever, Alex Pfeffer, set about trying to find the cells from the donor that were seeing the leukemia as being foreign and isolating those cells, and then learning how to grow those cells in vitro into large numbers and use them as a way of treating the leukemia. Well, they made a lot of headway in doing that, and then there were other breakthroughs that not only could you take those cells out, but you could put receptors into those cells that saw the leukemia specifically, and that's what's being done today. So we can take a patient that has leukemia or lymphoma or multiple myeloma, we can take their immune cells out, we can put in a receptor that sees the leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, grow those cells in vitro, reinfuse them, cure the patients of their disease. And there are now 6 such products that have been approved. These are so-called CAR T cells therapies. 6 are already approved by the FDA for use. They're changing the way we treat cancer. And there's going to be a tsunami of these coming. You know, there are scientific hurdles we have to overcome to make what works in leukemia and lymphoma work for breast cancer and prostate cancer, but that's what we're doing at the Hutch. That's a huge part of our efforts to try and make that happen. So that's a second big kind of therapy breakthrough that came from Don's work. The first is curing genetic diseases by gene therapy. The second is using our own immune system and T cells to eradicate malignancies. And the final one is really much more global. That is, if we can take out hematopoietic stem cells and transfer them, why can't we take out stem cells from other organs and transplant them and cure other diseases? And Don was the first, but he certainly won't be the last. And there are now therapies where, for example, diabetes is caused by a lack of beta cells in the pancreas, the insulin-producing cells. And so can you take out beta stem cells, grow them, give them back to patients, and have that cure the disease? And this is now being done, and clinical trials are underway. Can we take out the cells that are responsible for producing the chemicals that you need to overcome Parkinson's disease and reinfuse them into the brain? So this whole idea of the revolution in cell therapy is really happening, and it's going to be amazing to watch.
And a lot of it emerges from this work from Donnall Thomas. Well, my friends, we are going to leave some time for Q&A, so as we start to wrap up here, feel free to hit the QR code in your program or come on up to the microphone, and in just a couple of minutes we'll get in as many of those questions as we can. But before we do that, Fred, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about, you know, Don as a human being, and what it was in him what spark that kind of like let him persist when so many other people might have given up. Was there something about his personality? Was there something about the way he saw the role of a scientist that allowed him to keep going?
You know, I worked with Don for decades, and he was an incredible gentleman. He was really old school. I mean, I never heard him, honestly, I never heard him swear ever. I never heard him say a disrespectful thing about another individual. He was, I wouldn't say standoffish, but he was very proper. One of the funny stories was in 1990, Don won the Nobel Prize. I don't know if Pat's in the audience or not. Oh, she's here. So one of the nurses I worked really closely with told the story that she was driving to work when Don won the Nobel Prize. It was announced over the radio, and as Pat said, her heart just soared when she heard the news. And she's coming in early in the morning, and this is before the patients are up. It's still dark and quiet on the ward, and she goes to the nursing station, and the nurses are all, whispering excitedly about the news. And Don came from home because he was getting just besieged by, calls, and he decided he was going to escape to work. And so he goes in to work, and he drops his suitcase, his briefcase off his office, and he walks to the nursing station, and he tells the nurses the news, And he thanks the nurses for everything they did, saying, you know, this is an award for all of us. I mean, it was that kind of gracious. And then Pat even said that Don allowed her to give him a hug, which was unbelievable because everyone knew that Don was no hugger. I think there were three qualities of Don that struck me. The first was focus. You know, it's easy. It was easy for physicians and scientists to look here, look there, look somewhere else. Don was totally focused. He was the head of our cancer center, clinical cancer center, and other clinical cancer centers were becoming, oh, we have to be treating breast cancer, we have to be treating colon cancer, we have to be treating lung cancer. Everybody that Don hired early on was just to serve for marrow transplantation. So he had this incredible focus. He was going to do that. So it was focus and it was persistence. As he said, if he ever got to, you know, a true dead end, he probably would have done something, but he never did. There was always something else to try. And then the third quality of Don was his ability to create a team. He knew it was going to take a team to make it happen. It wasn't going to be one man's brilliance. He needed the other physicians, he needed the immunologists, he needed the nurses, he needed all of it. And so it was those three things. It was this focus, this persistence, and this teamwork. And now, why Don had that when other people don't, I don't know, but that's why he won the Nobel Prize, you know.
Right. Thanks so much. So just a handful of questions coming in. Please go ahead and get your question in as soon as possible if you want to ask one. One audience member would like to know why Don decided to do his work at the Hutch.
Great question. So he was in Cooperstown, and in the early 60s, he realized that he was making some headway in transplantation, but he realized that he needed other scientists around him, and being part of a bigger university would benefit him. And it just didn't exist in Cooperstown. So a guy by the name of Clem Finch had been his fellowship advisor at Harvard. He had moved to Seattle. And so Clem called Don up to come to Seattle and possibly interview for a job. And this was shortly after he first came out to give a lecture where he was able to participate in Nancy's cure. And he loved the Pacific Northwest. He was a big hunter and fisherman. I mean, those were his big passions outside of medicine, and his family was hunting and fishing. And so he loved the Pacific Northwest. And so he moved here. But he was given space in the public health hospital, which is that old, that sort of
castle.
That orange building at the south end of the Seattle. And he set up this clinic there, and he was taking care of patients there. And then he got a call that was pretty upsetting in 1970. Caspar Weinberger, who was, some of you may remember, who was secretary of HEW at the time, decided they were going to close all public health hospitals. That was sort of the public hospital at the time, and the Hoover Commission and then the Reagan administration felt that it would be cheaper to get the federal government out of healthcare and move it to the private sector. And so they closed all the public health hospitals. So Don suddenly had no place to practice. And there wasn't space at the university. And he wanted his own ward. He wasn't going to put his patients on someone else's ward. He wanted his own nurses. He wanted his own custodians. I mean, he did not he wanted to own the ward. And the university wouldn't give him that kind of space. He couldn't get that space at Swedish. But then in 1971 or 2, Bill Hutchinson had previously formed something called the Pacific Northwest Research Foundation. And then when his brother, Fred, the baseball player and manager, died, Bill decided that he was going to make it into a cancer center, cancer research center. And he had a good friend in the form of Warren Magnuson, Maggie, as he was affectionately called by people in the Pacific Northwest. And Maggie got a $5 million donation to help create the Fred Hutch Institute. At the same time, in 1971, Nixon signed the War on Cancer Act, which also allowed for some money, and the Hutch put in an award application for that. And so with Magnuson's gift and the award from the NCI as one of the first 8 cancer centers, the Hutchinson Center was formed. Now, Bill Hutchinson needed a clinical program. Don had no space, and so it was a perfect match. And so Don became the first clinical head at the Fred Hutch, and it was really because he needed space that he moved there, and how fortunate for all of us that that happened.
Yeah, right at the very beginning. I really like this question. The question is, was there anything left unfinished in terms of Don's goals during his lifetime? Where would he go next?
Well, you know, when Don won the Nobel Prize in 1990, we were doing about, the world was doing about 10,000 transplants a year. Now, there are about 100,000 transplants performed worldwide every year. So, I mean, think of that, from something that everyone said was impossible when Don started to something that's now done 100,000 times worldwide. I mean, that's just crazy. But when Don got the Nobel Prize, it was still, you know, in his Nobel Prize speech, he said, you know, it's still a difficult process, and we've been making progress slowly but surely. But you know, there's so much more to be done. And of course, there still is so much more to be done. We're way, way away from where we need to be. You know, there are still patients that we can't cure, and it you know, breaks our heart every time that happens. There are patients that we're curing, and they're paying a terrible price for the toxicities of the long-term effects. And until we get to the point where you know, we have vaccines that prevent us from developing cancer, or we have easy immunotherapies that we can simply give a simple shot and it goes away like the flu goes away, Don's work will not be done.
Yeah. Thank you. I can't see too well. Is there anybody at the mic, on the mic, who wants to ask a question? Please go ahead. Do we have a microphone that we could? Thank you. We have some folks streaming and watching at home, and this will help them hear you.
The people at home can't hear you. We'll get your mic right away.
How do you get it out?
Yeah.
I'm in touch at this point right now with a woman doctor at Hutch in regard to stem cells and macular degeneration. I'm of the age, about 90% of us have it. And I'm working with her. She says they've worked a lot with stem cells and macular eyes, but they can't figure out how to put the stem cells back in the eyes. And that's where she is right now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to be honest and tell you that I am not an expert on macular degeneration, but I do know absolutely that people have been able to grow the retinal stem cells in culture, in vitro, and have been exploring. There are a number of clinical trials in which people are putting back these cells into the eye. I can't tell you the exact state of that progress at the moment, but if you will send me an email or send an email to the Hutch, I'll make sure that we can get you more information about that. But there definitely is a huge amount of work going on about the possibility of stem cell replacement for macular degeneration, for sure.
All right, our final question, which may, excuse me, I'm so sorry. There's another person there, forgive me.
Thanks. Fred, could you tell me a little bit more? You happened to mention Joel Myers in passing. He was an old elementary school friend that I kind of lost track from over the years. And I heard that he had done some wonderful things. Could you give me a quick rundown of what it was that he did?
Sure. So early on, when we were first doing transplants, and Joel did a lot more than this, so I'll just give you one example. But early on, one of the horrible problems was something called cytomegalovirus, or CMV. CMV, a lot of us have CMV in our body, and in fact, probably the majority of us do. We get it as a child, and it stays within our body for the rest of our lives. But if you get very, very immune suppressed, the CMV can get reactivated. And so at the time we were doing transplants, about 50% of people would reactivate CMV, and of those, about half would develop serious CMV disease in their gut or their lungs, and half of them would die of it. So just starting with transplants, we knew that 15% of our patients were going to die of CMV. It was just terrible. And you'd be going rounds in the morning, and the patient would be fine. The next day, you'd see the patient, they'd say, you know, I have just a little dry cough. And you get a chest x-ray, and you see a little shadow, and you go, I know what's going to happen. And your heart would just sink because you knew they were going to develop CMV pneumonia. Well, Joel figured out how to prevent that. He figured out that CMV could be prevented by either, if you had never been exposed to CMV, giving you transfusions only from people who were also CMV negative, or to use a new drug called ganciclovir, and how to use that prophylactically in patients to prevent CMV disease. So Joel almost single-handedly took the mortality rate of CMV from 15% in our transplantations down to 0. And unfortunately, Joel died tragically at a young age, just after the paper demonstrating the ability to do that was published. He was a great guy.
Next question.
All right, so Fred, you talked a lot about what Don Thomas did, and is a brilliant man, but I think there's an impressive man sitting right there. I wonder what is your favorite contribution of your own that you made to the process of helping to cure cancer?
You got to read the book, Eric.
Can I nudge you a little bit? I mean, do you want to talk just a bit about the antibody-delivered radionuclides and antibody-delivered chemo drugs and so on? That's a huge deal.
Okay. First of all, nobody does anything alone, Gabriel, and everyone at the Hutch is so blessed to work with a great team of other colleagues. And anything that I achieved, believe me, if I had been anywhere else, would not have happened. It is an interesting story. In the the mid sort of 1980s, the way that we were doing transplants was by taking individuals and giving them chemotherapy and then giving them radiation to their entire body, because we wanted to eradicate all their leukemia, and we wanted to immune suppress them enough that the new marrow could take. But when we're doing that radiation, we're radiating their bone marrow and their leukemia, but we're also radiating their lungs and their GI tract, and it just seemed to me that there should be a better way. Two guys by the name of Kohler and Milstein developed in the mid-70s an ability to make something called monoclonal antibodies. And so these are small proteins that can react with a very specific protein on a cell surface. And it occurred to me that maybe we could take monoclonal antibodies and hook up radioisotopes to them and use that to target the radiotherapy exactly where we wanted, and therefore spare the toxicity to the GI, the lungs, the liver, but give more radiation to the site of disease. And so we started working on that. And there were a lot of twists and turns, which I'll get to in a second. But it actually does work, and this year there's a drug called IMAB-B, which is going to be approved by the FDA. It met its targeting agreement with the FDA, and so that's taking an idea, which is pretty cool to take an idea all the way from a concept to approval by the FDA. On the way, when we did the very first IMAB-B, the first studies with that, the thing we were targeting was something called CD33, which was on leukemia cells. And so we hooked up the antibody to an isotope and infused it. And I never forget, we worked in the animal models and it seemed to work. And then we did it in the very first human. And we had the patient sitting under a gamma camera, and we could see exactly where the antibody and isotope was going. It was going right to the bone marrow and exactly what we wanted. It looked great. And then we came back the next morning, there was nothing there. It was just, if that happened, it wasn't going to work. It had to stay where we were supposedly targeted. And what happened is we went back in the lab, and it turned out that CD33 internalizes when it hits the cell surface. The antibody and the isotope went in the cell cleaved off the isotope, excreted it, and went out in the urine, so it wasn't going to work. But because CD33 went in the cell, we said, hey, instead of putting radioactive iodine on it, what if we put a toxin on it? Could you then use that to target chemotherapy directly to the leukemic cell? And so we went back and we worked with a number of drug companies, started off with Lederle, and then it was American Home Products, and finally with Pfizer. And that turned out to be a drug that is the very first antibody conjugate approved by the FDA, something called Mylotarg or gentuzumab, ozogamicin, which is still part of initial therapy for AML with certain categories of AML. Well, you know, I don't know how much we helped jumpstart the field. I'd like to think we did a little, but now there have been at least 15 other antibody drug conjugates that have been approved by the FDA, and there are more than 250 new ones being developed by different companies. So that was one little story where we tried something. At first it didn't work, but we took that failure and turned it into a success and led to the first approved antibody drug conjugate. And by the way, that I did with a guy by the name of Irv Bernstein, who was, he's the one that actually made the CD33 antibody and was a partner in that research. And then we changed from CD33 to CD45 to find a better target for our radioisotope labels. And that is now a therapy that's being emerging as well.
Such an elegant concept. Do we have this one more question?
Yes, if I may. Thank you so much for a wonderful and informative evening. And one thing that really struck me was the quality that you described in Don Thomas as being tremendously focused. And it strikes me and maybe some other clinicians and researchers maybe here in the room that we see a tidal wave of new technologies. You mentioned CRISPR-Cas earlier, and so I'm wondering if you have any comments or maybe advice for budding physicians or scientists about worthy direction to pursue in lieu of this tidal wave of someone who's really passionate about the cures of tomorrow, but how can they apply this technology? How can they hope to narrow their focus in the same way that you and so many others at the Hutch have?
You know, I'm not unhappy that I'm nearing the age of retirement. It does take I think a different kind of talent to succeed today than succeeded, not entirely, don't get me wrong, it's not entirely different, but it does take a different group of talents, I think, to be really successful today than maybe it did when I was developing a career, when Don was developing a career. The science is moving so rapidly. I mean, I try to keep up. You know, much to the chagrin of my wife, I spend most evenings, reading, whether it's Nature, Science, New England Journal, and trying to maintain some literacy with it. And it is moving so incredibly rapidly. Still, I think within that, it's important to focus on one specific question. Now, you have to learn these different technologies to answer that question, but picking, not getting distracted by all different shiny things, picking a question, a challenge of, can you figure out why this strange phenomenon happens? Can you figure out why I give chemotherapy to a culture of 100 cells and I kill 90 of them, but I don't kill 10, even though they're all genetically identical? And then I let those 10 grow up and to another 100, and I give chemotherapy again, and I kill 90% of them, but 10 persist. Why is that? What happens? Or, whatever the question is, but it's focusing on the question, not getting distracted by other things around you. But at the same time, you have to continue to be willing to learn new technologies. And that's one of the things I think that where people get hung up is that they keep trying to redo the same experiment using the same old technologies. And if you're afraid to develop new technologies, then I think that's also a disaster. But still, I think the issue of focusing on a question, on a problem, is what Don did. He focused on one question: could you transplant bone marrow between individuals who are not identical twins? That was, could you do that? And that's how he focused.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody so much for your attention, for your fantastic questions. You can buy the book right out there, thanks to our friends at Third Place Books. And thank you so much, Fred Appelbaum, for writing it and for talking about it tonight. We
Pleasure,
appreciate it.